Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fifth episode of Leadership Under Fire, Crossing Borders and Student Affairs, Global Perspectives on Inclusion and Support. My name is Dr. Melissa Watley. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the College of William and Mary. I am also the editor-in-chief of the Critical Internationalization Studies Review. I'm going to ask, oh, thank you, Arif. I was going to ask you to mute. So we're going to get started here. First, I want to acknowledge the land that the College of William and Mary sits on. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the land that our campus is on today. The Chero-Nahaka, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nanasemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawamek, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respects to their tribal members, past and present. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker before we get started with our panel discussion. Dr. Birgit Schreiber is president of the International Association of Student Affairs and Services, and I will pass the floor over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm wondering if I need to change my name. Are you okay with my name this way? I must admit, I've had a bit of a nightmare with this team log on, and I've been jammed up with who knows what it is. One never knows what's going on in the background. So my name is Birgit Schreiber. I do have a surname. And I would like to share my presentation with you, which I can't share from my desk, but I think the colleagues in Canada will share it. So I'm Birgit. Just briefly to locate myself, I'm a professor of psychology at the education faculty in Cape Town, South Africa. And I also lead a project for SARUA. SARUA is an umbrella body for the 16 countries south of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, so just south in the southern parts of Africa. I have other foot in Europe. I work and live in Europe, and so I've got my foot on two parts of the continent, well, two parts of the globe, in the south and the global north. And so that gives me sort of a particular lens to think about student affairs. I've been in student affairs for 25 years. I started off as a psychologist and then slipped into management, as many of us do, end up in senior leadership in student affairs. So thank you very, very much for having me and making the time to listen to my thoughts. I hope I can share some exciting and interesting thoughts with you. And thank you very much for having me. I've put together a few slides, and I've been given just a few minutes or 7 minutes or so, and I think I've tried to cram in as much as I can and brought some of the sort of key pillars of what I think about when I think about student affairs and internationalization. And the first one here you see is, and each slide has sort of a key term and a key concept, and I'd love you to take notes and let me know what you think about these ideas. So the first is that student success is everyone's business. In fact, it came from a conversation I was in about 2 weeks ago. I was invited to a conversation where somebody had disputed that, and I thought surely that's common knowledge, and so I thought I'd make it very, very clear that success is everyone's business. That is a visionary issue. It has to do with, do we care about student success? Is this part of our overall vision? Do our leaders in the leadership on all positions, I mean, we all lead from various positions, but it's a leadership issue. Does leadership inculcate and acknowledge that student success, international students, local students, whatever it might be, is part of leadership? Student success has operational parts, of course. They monitor student success. They may monitor demographics. They may monitor who's more successful than the other. They may, permit financial grants and so forth. So there's an operational component. And of course, it always must be aligned to funding. So you see this messy little plait here, and that's kind of how it works, you know. Some strands go a bit messy on the sides, and student affairs is a really hard and not so neat business. It's very hard work. But you see that in essence, these things need to speak to each other and need to be aligned and threaded together in order to make sure we have student success. So it's everyone's business in essence. The second thought I want to bring you is a model of student affairs and student success that I've developed with a number of colleagues. We've written together over the last 5 years on issues of student affairs across the globe. And here, the student affairs, it was quite interesting. We did a research project post-COVID, and we had done a large sort of survey on how does student affairs and the idea of student success, the idea of student support and development for international students, for all kinds of students and institutions, how has it changed post-COVID? And a number of responses, and I won't get into the research, but what came from it was the idea that student affairs mediates various sectors across the university for students. So it helps and mediates and supports the personal domain. You see number 1 here. So student affairs is in part focused on the individual student. It focuses on how do we support this one student? How do we see, recognize, acknowledge this one student, this unique student, and how do we support this student? The second part that student affairs and services focuses on is the sociocultural domain. It's a focus on how does the university feel around inclusion, around social connectedness, around engagement. How are the cultural messages? How are the social messages? How are the gender roles? How are the familial conditions? How is the culture and the social space into which our students are embedded? How is it shaped? And can we support it? Can we do something with that? Can we use it? Can we, leverage social relationships to help students be more successful? And then you see the third domain that student affairs leverages and mediates, which is the academic domain. Of course, student affairs is focused on academic support and helping students cope in the academic space. And we work with lecturers and deans and with management and with curriculum design in order to make the academic space a palatable and engaging one for students. And then the fourth domain that student affairs is really active in, particularly since COVID, because we had to lobby much more, we had to be much more active, is the public domain, worrying about home environments, transport, funding, visas, electricity, and so forth. And while I say all of this, I need to declare that, of course, I work in Africa, and in Africa, you can imagine the context into which universities are embedded are not a social welfare space. So Europe has a social welfare space, and it's a caring social welfare environment. Whereas in Africa, that is not the case. It's sort of a bit similar like in the USA, where the environment does not have a social welfare space. And so the universities need to do a lot of the kind of lobbying and working and supporting for students. So this is the model you see here. And another key thing I want to pin into the ground is that I think it's very important for student affairs, and if you then focus on the international student, is to view the student as a contextualized student. So a university is, of course, not a meritocracy. A university does not promote those students who do just well. It promotes those students who do well because they live in a good environment, because things are good for them. Learning comes easy. Moving around is easy. Finances are there. It's easy to read a book, open it, switch on electricity and Wi-Fi and the computer, and so it goes. So in our work with students, we need to be aware of that many students grapple with contexts that disadvantage them, that hold them back despite merit, despite ability. So I think we need to be aware of that. So there is a broad kind of discourse on the decontextualized learner. We speak about the learner as though, if they're talented, they'll manage, And of course, that's of course, very, very myopic, and it's really not seeing the wider picture. Knowledge isn't neutral. I'm looking at time and I'm realizing I need to speed on. And, you know, the last point here on the left is that the idea that if you just apply yourself, it'll all come to you. The idea of the American dream is we've woken up from that, and it's become a bit of a nightmare because, of course, our context and our histories and our familial and social environments we live in really can hold us back, and we need to think about that. Exactly. Let me speed on. I see that time is going. I'll take another 3 minutes. The other thing I want to pin into the ground is that context matters. So context, and we can go right to the next one. And next one, within the institution, our worry needs to be, so when we in student affairs support or develop or engage with our students, we want to worry about the many parts in the institution that they need, for them feels like one whole. For us, we just come in saying, how are you doing in maths? How are you doing in your residences? How are you doing with your symptoms of anxiety? How is your visa? So we might just see a part of it rather than what our student experiences, which is the whole institution. And then the next slide, you see here that we as student affairs professionals supporting and worrying for international students, and I'll make that reference because that's our focus today, but for all students, we need to worry about what their context is within which they live, what matters to them, who do they return to at the end of the day, where do they come from when we see them on campus. And I've got 4 more slides. The next slide you see, and I lifted that because it just seemed all of a sudden, I lifted that concept for us here because I thought all of a sudden it's so interesting to think about the idea that there is a profound interdependence. And when your students come here, they are deeply, or if we come to them, at them, and with them, and we support them with an idea of profound interdependence, as Mboti says, then that, I think, makes for meaningful support and for efficient or effective support. So just quickly, in terms of internationalization on the next slide, just to focus some things that in the international student affairs domain has been debated is, of course, the idea of mobility. We ought to, you know, we measure our international success with how many students change degrees and move around and how many people we welcome from other parts of the world. So I would advocate to move away from the idea that mobility it's one measure and it's a fine measure, but it certainly shouldn't be the central measure of what internationalization is about. There is a risk of commercialization, and we need to think about when we think about mobility, how that advantages perhaps one person rather than a whole curriculum, a whole experience, or a whole kind of diverse group of students on our campus. So just the next 2 slides, we can whip right over them. The idea here is that in internationalization, what we need to do, I think, on our campuses is foreground the SDGs. And you're familiar with SDGs as much as you are familiar with SDGs. Are you? Oh, thank you very much. I was recently in a conversation in the USA, and I needed to explain the SDGs, and that's a global contract for social justice that we all, and I must qualify, the SDGs have got, you know, huge problems, and I've published a paper on critiques on the SDGs and how the SDG 4 for education is far from perfect, and, you know, we need to improve it, of course. But the SDGs is one of the global contracts for social justice, and that is what I think should inform internationalization. So the idea, if you go to the next slide, the next one. So if the idea that when we speak about internationalization for our students, we, I think, should foreground the idea that we live in a global context, and that the competencies for staff on the one hand need to be locally relevant. That means what kind of students do you have in this environment, in this university, so it needs to be immediate and local and indigenous, but it needs to always be with a knowledge of what goes on in the world and how do we impact that. Macaulay speaks very interestingly about critical professional development and speaks about the idea that while we develop competencies in our staff to serve our students, at the same time, our staff needs to be aware of the broader debates and tensions in the environment in which our students live and learn and need to be successful. Thank you very much. I've taken way more time than I was permitted to take, and I thank you very much for allowing me the time. Thanks very, very much, and I hope there are some discussions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schreiber. That gave us a lot to think about. We really appreciate your opening remarks. And if you have questions as the webinar continues, please ask them in the Q&A or in the chat. We will get to those at the end of the session. So we have two fantastic panelists with us today. The first one is Danae Bélanger. She's Vice Principal of Student Affairs at Bishop's University. And then also Dr. Ansley Carey is Vice President of Students at the University of British Columbia. I am going to pass things over to our wonderful moderator, Dr. Christine Arnold. Dr. Arnold is Interim Associate Vice President and Dean of Students and an Associate Professor and Chair of the Adult Education Post-Secondary Studies Program in the Faculty of Education at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. A bit of a mouthful. Dr. Arnold, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here today and see how widely attended this is. It's absolutely exceptional. We're here today to discuss an integral topic within our field, internationalization within student affairs and services among senior leaders, working in this space and sharing their policy and practices with others. This is going to be an exciting discussion because we've composed a collection of informative questions for them to consider today, and the questions cross-examine several concepts and considerations that we value in student affairs and services. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists in a little more detail. So Dr. Ansley Carey is a highly respected higher education administrator with more than 2 decades of experience. He earned his doctorate from the University of Florida and graduate degrees in business and law from Auburn University and the University of Southern California, respectively. He served as the vice president for students at Auburn University and the University of Southern California and the University of British Columbia. Carey has major university initiatives in response to sexual violence prevention, strategic planning, and anti-racism. Most importantly, Carey is the author of Washington Next, Disputed Monuments, Symbols, and Honorees on Campus. Hundreds of universities still host and defend campus memorials to slave owners, Confederate soldiers, and Ku Klux Klan leaders. At the same time, their purport and interest in equity and conclusion. In Washington Next, Carey analyzes the catalyst for memorial disputes on campuses between 2015 and 2020. The analysis reveals important insights for how universities respond and essential factors to consider. It also uncovers some hidden dilemmas in memorial disputes. Danae Bélanger is a Zimbabwean-born trilingual student services and immigration professional who currently serves as the Vice Principal Student Affairs at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke in Quebec. She has spent the last 17 years navigating Canada's many immigration and social systems for various institutions in 5 of Canada's provinces. She has a master's degree from the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, in diversity education. Her research was on the important role that post-secondary leaders have in creating community for students, as well as how community building can create stronger institutions. She also has a Bachelor of Arts honors in English Language and Literature and was one of the earliest regulated Canadian immigration consultants in Canada, obtaining her designation in 2015. Extremely impressive. As a Black woman and immigrant, she has had first experience as a user and educator of Canada's post-secondary institutions and immigration programs, as well as the challenges that marginalized people face, experiences that have enabled her to provide the highest level of service to some of those vulnerable in post-secondary institutions, and this experience has informed her research in community building and public policy, as well as her inherent desire to advocate for improved immigration systems in the post-secondary sector. She's educated the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary Police recruits and local RCMP about racial bias amongst Black people, and has advocated and supported a wide spectrum of student groups within student services. Without further ado then, now that we have some great introductions of these outstanding individuals, we're going to jump into the collection of questions we have for them today. The first question I want to pose to both of you is that earlier this year, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada announced a decrease in the number of temporary residents from 6.5% of Canada's total population down to 5% by 2026. To achieve this goal, the Government of Canada introduced several challenges to the International Student Program, including caps on study permit applications. With the Government of Canada having issued international student enrollment caps during the course of this academic year and a further 10% reduction for the following academic year, there are associated financial, political, and sociocultural ramifications. I'm wondering today, how do we ensure that international students who are currently enrolled across our institutions are well supported despite this decrease that is going to occur and has already started? And I'll allow you to decide the order here. I imagine it's going to bounce back and forth a little.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you, Ainsley. I mean, as an immigration professional and as a post secondary administrator, I can unequivocally say that this has been the hardest 18 months that we've experienced supporting students and working with institutions in this country. Just for my context, for the Quebec context, we're kind of in a triple whammy situation here because we are, of course, at the federal level dealing with the decrease in international student enrollment and all of the implications that that has on us as a small liberal institution, small English language institution in a French province. We are also, just a few moments ago, the Premier of Quebec tabled some legislations that would further limit or add stresses to those caps, particularly for institutions like Bishops. And then we're also facing tuition funding structures as well, where even though Bishops is excluded from the new higher tuition rates for English language institutions in Quebec. We're still also have some restrictions on how we collect tuition fees imposed on us by the province. And to top it all off, we are fighting, like many of you, to change this perception that Canada is not a welcoming place. And, I'm sure there are a lot of discussions happening at your institution, certainly at ours, about what we can do to change that perception in students, but not only that, but to make them feel it. So some of the things that we are doing right now, I mean, I've been very clear with my team and with the principal here that now is not the time for cuts in international education. We need to continue to invest in what we've built as a collective community across this country, but also at our institutions. At Bishops, our international center is only about 4 or 5 years old. And so we've spent a lot of time really building that community and making it a real legitimate aspect of our institution. And so, when we're all looking at cuts at our institutions, I firmly believe that now is not the time. We need to be investing in the way that we support students who are here and making them feel like they have all the resources and tools that they need to be able to graduate and have prospects for the future. We also need to invest in human resources. So that means not cutting back on staff or asking staff to do more, because like I said at the top, we're all collectively exhausted. We've had to deal with, the trusted institutional framework or now recognized institutional framework. We've had to deal with immigration policy change after immigration policy change, and it's really having a toll on the team. So from our end, we're trying to create systems that are going to support this changing era that we're going into. I like to think of this period of time as an opportunity for us to really examine, what it is we want international education to look like, not just at our institution, but in this country. I think we can all agree that the cycle of exploitation that we were seeing was not good for our brand. And it was not good for us as professionals with, who are bound by professional ethics and by just, a moral sense of supporting, students who are coming for a way better chance at a future or to get a better education. So for me, I think that's what I'm striving to do here with my team. We have to be creative. We have to think about how we are going to uh, continue to support what we've already built. But it is going to be hard. And one of the things that I do with my team is being transparent. And I know that we have not received a lot of transparency ourselves as institutions, but this is the time for it. And I think that will help us develop those systems of support that we need going into the future.
Well, thank you so much for that very comprehensive response. I don't think there's much more for me to say with regard to the topic following that response. However, I will. First, let me say thank you for creating this platform. I want to thank everyone that's been responsible for pulling us all together, introducing this topic, and being so thoughtful in the outline. I think Dr. Schreiber really outlined a very comprehensive global perspective around issues of student affairs, which I thank her for. And I think there's some nuggets from that presentation that I hope we will pull forward in our ongoing discussion. I'd like to thank Dr. Watley for her work and leadership behind the scenes to make all of this happen. And Dr. Arnold, thank you so much for facilitating this panel. It's been quite a pleasure. Let me take the question and dive into some of the context that was established. You mentioned the Canadian government has presented a few challenges. I'll focus on that word challenges as we think about how do we support the students who are currently on the ground, students who are currently enrolled. Challenges, the other side of that word, are opportunities. What are the opportunities that have been created by these challenges? Currently, as we think about our students, one of the things that's critically important is that we communicate clearly with our students. This gives us an opportunity for students who are raising their hand to say, hey, what's going on right now? Explain the legislation. What does it mean for my enrollment? What does it mean for my employment prospects? What does it mean for my research as a graduate student where I have to travel back home for the holidays and then I will come back to do my research? So this has created an opportunity for us to engage our international students to say, hey, let's take some time, understand the legislation as a university, and then invest in helping communicate that legislation to students, help them understand their concerns, help them understand the opportunities that are embedded in this new challenge that's before us. So I think right now it's more important, as already been said, that universities double down on communicating clearly and precise with our students about what the current legislation means for the currently enrolled student, the student who's on our campus right now. I know in a few more questions, we'll analyze future generations of international students, but right now I'll stay with the current students. The next thing that's important for us, as already been mentioned, is for us to remain consistent with our programs and services, what's been delivered. Now is not the time to start drawing down programs, reducing activities, reducing what our commitments and our promises in housing and dining and childcare and helping students immigrate into the country, helping students establish citizenship, helping students pursue their degree program. Now is the time for us to remain consistent with what we've done and find opportunities to fill gaps of what's been needed. Because the student who's here right now, it's our duty to invest in them and make sure that they are successful throughout the process. So communication clear is important. Consistency is critical. But this is the window for us to develop our international strategy for the future. And that is why I appreciated Dr. Schreiber's presentation so much, because there's a lot of future thinking in there. There's a lot of future opportunities for us not to think about internationalization purely from a mobility perspective, but there's internationalization as part of a capacity building activity where some of our institutions can spend more time in international countries educating students there and helping build capacity for greater education. So we are in the education business. And wherever we deliver that education, maybe somewhere else in the world, in a post-COVID environment, we now know that education is not geographical. Education could be almost anywhere. So how do we get creative by thinking about the new tools in our hands and the new challenges or opportunities that the government has put in front of us? So these three things are my focus for our currently enrolled students. Back to you, Dr. Arnold.
Thank you both very much. I think we heard some really commonalities in those responses. These are some opportunities, and the transparency and the trust are a large piece, I heard. We need to be careful with these students and let them know and make sure they're clear about the fact that we're here from them and how we're going to be here for them. I also heard a lot about what we want internationalization to look like, and we have a question on that later, so we'll leave that for the moment. But I also think there was a big piece here on not changing anything at the moment and that keeping that consistency. There's so much afoot right now with regard to that federal policy and how it's presenting provincially, locally, at our institutional, level. We need to be careful that we protect this situation in this moment. And that's one thing that we can control. In a moment where we can't control a great amount, we can control that, which is helpful. So our second question, since we got started a little late here, I want to make sure to move us along. In the Canadian context, more than 95% of universities report that their strategic or long-term planning documents make or will make explicit reference to internationalization or global engagement. Of the responding institutions, 82% report that internationalization was one of the top priorities, indicating that internationalization strategies are an important aspect of Canadian institutions' strategic plans. In addition, since 2008, the Government of Canada has implemented several policy changes to make studying in Canada more attractive for international students, including the postgraduate work permit program. Well, the Government of Canada's priorities are clearly shifting, as we know. As an institutional leader, how do you continue to move internationalization conversations, programs, and initiatives forward? And are there strategies and mechanisms that you can employ to maintain motivation and ensure that internationalization remains within these overall institutional strategic plans? And I'm wondering, Dr. Carey, do you want to kick us off this time?
Of course, I'll go first since my
Perfect.
colleague here went first the last time. So thank you. I think this is an important question, and this hinted at some of the opportunities moving forward. How do we keep international initiatives front and center, and how do we think about moving them forward? In every economy or every political environment, there are opportunities as well as challenges. And I'll come back to there are opportunities embedded in our current challenge. So, for some perspective, universities have been around for 100 plus years, many of our institutions throughout Canada and different parts of the United States and in Africa. And they have seen different economies. We have seen different governments. We have seen different political leadership. Some of them have been very anti-international students. Some of them have been pro, just like you mentioned in 2008, and not a lot of Canadian legislation focused on how do we build our international capacity. So in every economy, there are opportunities, and universities have survived. Universities as institutions are designed to survive the changing political environment, the changing economic environment. So I say that to say, don't panic. Now is not the time to panic. It is the time to be alert. It is the time to seek opportunities and think about what we can do moving forward. One of the initiatives or some of the ideas that continue to percolate in my mind as we engage our international colleagues on campus, who we've formed a task force and a committee to think about how do we continue to support international students who are here, but also what is our international strategy for the future? Some of that strategy, of course, remains in recruiting students. How do we continue to look at the globe and recruit students? Many institutions are dependent upon a small number of countries to support their international student needs. How do we diversify the market of international students that we invite and recruit into our institutions? So, of course, recruitment is one aspect of it. Another part of the international experience is helping Canadian students have international experiences in other parts of the world. I remember when I was going to school in the 80s and a student took a semester to study abroad. It was a really big deal. It was something that some of us couldn't afford to do as first generation students. So it was a really big deal to study abroad. Now, more and more students are studying abroad. So we have accomplished some of the study abroad opportunities. We want to make sure those opportunities remain available for all income levels of students and continue to do work in that space. But then I think there's a third sector, which I've hinted at before, is about capacity building. How do we work with international countries and communities to go there and help those universities build capacity to educate more students? Things like 2+2 programs, where a student starts their first 2 years at a university somewhere else in the world and then completes their last 2 years at another university or at a Canadian university and earn degrees from both of those institutions. We are in the education business. And if we keep that front and center, the number of opportunities really multiplies. Now, there will be challenges by the government about who comes into the country and who exits the country, and it's not unique to Canada. Australia is doing the same thing from time to time, depending on who the political leadership in the US. That will happen in the US as well. But if we remain in the education business and continue to think about how to deliver education, we can really educate the world from some of our institutions throughout Canada and throughout the United States. So I want to continue this encouragement in this conversation about the forward piece of internationalization focused on delivering education. I think when we start talking about borders, we create borders. When we start talking about education, we create opportunities.
I wholeheartely agree. I think that somewhere along the line, internationalization became quite transactional, with only one side seeming to benefit from that exchange of knowledge, if you want to call it that. And I think it will be important as folks go into, I know we're going into a strategic planning process here, but to think about how we are planning to add value on the other side. So it's looking at the international partnerships that we have, how where we plan to have a presence and how that presence aligns with where we want to be as an institution. I think that there has been a lot of discussion, particularly with all of these policy changes, about how bad internationalization is or how bad international students have been. And it's quite a prevalent conversation here in Quebec. But I think that we need to refocus on what the intention was originally for creating these internationalization strategies, which was, sharing knowledge beyond our ecosystems on our campus. And, when I think of what I've seen in the last 5 years, there hasn't been much in the way of sharing in some aspects. It's been quite I don't know what the word is, but like we've been pulling out a lot of resources without investing back into the areas that we've pulled out of. And I think from an ethical standpoint, this should not be the goal of an educational institution. The goal of an educational institution should be the pursuit and the sharing of knowledge. So I totally agree. I think here we're looking at things like how we can support academics in places in the world right now where they can't continue research, where they can't continue to teach, where they do have a challenge completing their program, and seeing how our institution can play a role in moving those things forward. We want to be able to say proudly that Canadian institutions have created a pathway for people across the world to pursue their academic goals. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to come here to do that. And I think that's where it's been lost in the messaging a bit.
Thank you both. I'm excited as someone who examines transitions and pathways to hear all of that conversation here, because you spoke about the capacity building in those international countries and communicating and educating more students, and the 2+2 programs. I think the 2+2 programs are extremely valuable for those transitions, but also for the academics. You use pathways deny, and I think that's so important that those pathways are there. And like you said, the pathways could be more local in nature, but could be, a lot more global internationalization in their conception and who supports them and the networks and the communities we draw on, which is really important. I also heard quite a bit here about intentionality. We do need to be intentional in our actions. Dr. Carey, you've said several times there's opportunity here, and you're right. We don't get a moment to often step back and think and to process and consider and want to know where we are and what internationalization actually looks like in this moment. But we can right now. And that's where I'm going to turn to our last question for the day, because we had this question when preparing this session as well. So, what does an internationalized student affairs and service division look like in this moment? And how are student affairs and services professional competencies that are identified within NAFSA, ACPA, NASPA, and our Canadian caucus models, how do they assist with training and preparing professionals who are competent in internationalization?
Okay, I guess I can go. So I mean, at our campus, we've adopted something called the curricular approach to student services. So we look at things like personal growth, equity, curiosity, community engagement, and that really is the core tenet of how we deliver our programming and our engagement here on campus. So what does that mean from an international context? It means ensuring that our learners are operating from the same baseline that any other domestic student would. So looking at how we deliver things like consent education and alcohol and harms reduction education, and not assuming that we all have the same concept of what that looks like, valuing the experiences and the knowledge of folks who are not from the same context as we are. And I know sometimes, operating in Quebec seems like you're operating in a different country separate from Canada. But I think that is the opportunity, because we are in the business of opening up the world to the community. And, it is, to me, it has been a challenge to promote and encourage that forward thinking. I think in some very established systems and very established ways. But I think it starts really with looking at what we currently offer our students and making sure that we are continuing to include the perspectives of other members of our community, and making sure that those perspectives are embedded in the work that we do. So it means that evaluating those international student perspectives, having them involved in, program planning and engagement opportunities, understanding that yes, we want to explain and promote and maybe transition students into a way of life here, but also seeing it as an opportunity to experience a way of life that is different from what we're used to. I'm very focused on community building. I did my master's research on that, and I do feel that people want to be in a place where they feel like they are part of a community. And you don't feel like you're part of a community unless you see yourself in that community. And I think now, as we go into this period where a lot of international students are questioning whether or not they want to be here. Those perspectives and those experiences will become more and more important. And so I'm very much looking forward to going through that strategic planning process here and, seeing where they think that we will be in 5 years and how we're going to get there, and who is going to go on that journey with us. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to add on to that because I think that's an incredible response to this question. Many of our institutions, as I mentioned, 100 plus years old, we were designed for a particular population. We were designed for men whose families had opportunities and privileges to send their kids off to college. Over the 100-year period, universities have evolved as more students, women were enrolled, students of color, international students, indigenous students, students experiencing trauma at home. So our universities grew more and more diverse over the 100 plus year period as we've invited and recruited and engaged and created supportive communities for different populations of students. One of the things universities have not done completely is completely pivot from the model that it was designed initially from. So if we look at many of our programs and services, they are still designed for the traditional 18-year-old first-year student coming from a family with income to support their housing, dining, recreation, classes, instruction, spring break trips. So as we continue to move our universities into the next century, we have to start to re-examine old models. More importantly, examine which pockets and populations of students we currently underserve because the model is 100 years old. You look back at some of our university policies and procedures, you can tell they were written in the 70s and 80s. It's an entirely different student sitting in front of us right now. And these current policies and procedures don't make sense to them, doesn't work for them, doesn't help them retain at the university. And then when we challenge those policies and procedures, you'll often hear people say, that's kind of how we've always done it. That's the basis of our policy position on university campus. This is how we've always done it. So I think part of the opportunity moving forward, as we think about the unique populations on campus, and I'm talking international students from all over the world, graduate students, older students, students over a traditional age, not 18 to 25. We even think about parents that are on campus now, whether they're graduate students with families or graduate students who are single parents. How have we evolved our universities to make sure that all populations of students feel supported? Now, I know it's complicated. Are we making sacrifices here? Are we trading one thing off here? But when we pause and really think about the delivery of education, we are attempting to deliver education to all students enrolled. And our goal is to make sure that they're all successful, that they all graduate. Now we have to pivot the educational model to make sure those things are in place. Now, we can't just go into a dark room and design our new policies for the future. We have to listen to students. So listening sessions with communities of students, international graduate students, parents, students over traditional age, listening sessions are critical. And leave those listening sessions understanding what are the policy implications of these listening sessions? What are the new ways that we should think about how we register students, how we make decisions about housing, how we make decisions about who dines on campus, how we make decisions about who lives on campus? What are the requirements of a doctoral student? What is the relationship with a doctoral student and their principal investigator? How do we make decisions about financial aid? So I think these are kind of the golden era for higher education because we kind of get a chance to go to a dry erase board, wipe it off, and say, let's challenge the systems that were designed 100 years ago and think about how do we support students for the future. I'm not talking about the academic curriculum. So I'm not challenging chemistry or math or physics or science. What I'm challenging is how we support students and how the university is designed traditionally to support an 18 to 20-year-old first year student. How do we design it now for a much more globally competent and diverse student body? And that requires listening, and some real challenges to our existing policy. So from a student affairs personnel perspective, it's really about revisiting our past to see how we can reshape it for the current generation of students that are in front of us right now.
This is an incredible conversation. I'm excited about many, many elements, but I'm going to pick up one. The supports and services following that more traditional model is one of the areas that honestly, I would say gives me the most concern. And I think it is a moment to turn it on its head, especially those that are underserved, as you say, Dr. Carey. I love your listening sessions. I use design thinking perspective in my courses with my graduate students and, in the work I do here in the AVPAS office. And I do that in terms of, asking that question, who are we actually serving? And that we want to work with students and not for students. We're not designing for them. We should be designing with them. And I think that's really important here. I also just want to highlight that in that moment of working with them and turning these traditions on their head, when we look at the competencies, I'm going to highlight our Canadian one because, forgive me, we're in that space a little bit today. The Canadian Association of College and University Student Services caucus looks at intercultural fluency as one of the competencies and professional acumen. And I love a few of the items here. They recognize intellectual and emotional dimensions with more than one worldview, ask questions about other cultures and seek out answers to those questions, and initiate and develop positive interactions with culturally different others. This is in that moment of the listening sessions and considering what could be and turning some of those traditional policies and procedures that we sit in meetings over and over again and hear them repeated, but for what purpose, we can speak up and have that moment to say, no, it's actually time to take a bit of a pause. And I'm hearing that a little bit today about those pauses. Speaking of pauses, though, we're going to turn over now the time in our program here to a bit of a moderated discussion with everyone involved. So we have a great amount of participants. We have 50 participants on the call right now, and we want to turn this over to some questions from all of them with regard to the topic we're speaking about today, which is that internationalization in student affairs and services. So I know that folks are generally a little shy to pipe up with a question, but you can put it in the chat, or you can come on board here, turn on a camera or not, and pose a question to Dr. Carey or Denai. Oh, we already have one. Burgit, would you like to start us off? Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I can see on my picture, I've got this weird ghostly look behind me. The lights are off, so apologies for that. There were just wonderful points you made. There were 2 or 3 that are listed here. The first one I wanted just to share with you that the world, as far as I know it, and I'm familiar with parts of the world in Europe and in Southern Africa, thinks of Canada very, very highly as a very welcoming, gentle place that is respectful to its students. And so it's a warm place. It's not considered as an unattractive place at all. It's a desirable, warm place. I wanted just to put that out. The other thing I wanted to raise was we need to think about why we want to internationalize. We're not going to just do that for in and of itself so that people can travel. Traveling is not our work. So we need to think about why do we internationalize? And then if we think about, in my view, it would be that we want to promote social justice across the globe. We want people to know one another, to have better lives, to know more languages. And we know that education in the international space makes for more, for peace, for geopolitical peace, and so forth, for more insight. And, we know that internationalization contributes to a better life for all. So that is our aim. And if that is our aim, our focus ought to be on all students, not on just those that arrive with a foreign passport, but are those that live in the residences with them, that go into the same courses with them, to go to the same supervision. So if you have a visiting student arriving in Canada, I hope that student imparts their knowledge and their experience to a wider group. So the focus is not just on that one student, that would kind of be missing the point of the overall aims of that. Thank you very, very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Burgit. I appreciate that. We have a second hand, and forgive me, I hope I pronounce this correctly. Flavia?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry for my English. Actually, I'm Brazilian, so it's not my first language. But actually, I was really interested because I always wish that I could study in Canada. I always thought that it was a great experience. It's completely different from what we have here. I live in Salvador, so we don't have the cold, environment. So it's a huge difference from here, but actually from every single point. So I, my actually question is, uh, do you have experience with Brazilians where you teach, where you have your internationalization program, or is actually more to students who speaks uh, English as their first language?
Well, I mean, I can start. The unique thing about Bishops is that we are an English-speaking institution in a very French part of Canada. And a lot of our students, either had to learn to speak English at school, or are coming to Bishops because they want to learn English. So that's really shaped how we approach language at our institution. And like other institutions in Quebec, we are provincially mandated to follow certain language laws. I think in the experience of maybe a student from Brazil or an international student, that's kind of a unique opportunity, because not only are you in an environment where you are able to essentially learn both languages at once, but you're also not made to feel different because your English does not sound perfect. And this kind of goes back to what Dr. Schreiber was saying about like why we want to internationalize. And I think in the case of Bishops, you know, we've kind of internationalized even at home because we were pushed to change the way that we recruit based on, the new federal laws and the new provincial requirements on tuition. We've had to start recruiting in very French communities within this province where before we never would have ever gone to. And in a sense, some of the students who are coming to our institutions are exposed to a whole world of individuals that they may have never come across had they gone to a Francophone institution. So I think the exciting thing about coming to Canada, and I'm not just saying, coming to Bishops, coming anywhere to Canada, is the ability to immerse yourself in an environment where you really can feel excited about learning and not feel hesitant about the spotlight that it will place on you. So, if your goal is to come to Canada, I super encourage you to do that. As a former international student to Canada myself, this has been a life-changing opportunity for me. And, don't be afraid of cold weather. Canada is designed for cold, and I'm sure you'll adjust.
Mm-hmm. And let me only add that at UBC, English is not required as a first language, but English fluency is necessary. So we have many students here where English is their second language. All of the courses are taught in English. All of the instructors provide instruction in English, but English as a first language is not a requirement, but English fluency is. Dr. Schreiber mentioned the why. I do feel like we need to be critical about why internationalization is important. We start with the assumption that it is important because we want education from all over the world. We want to support people from all over the world. However, when you really dig into international education, it was a money flow. Many institutions recruited international students to support the revenue flow of the university because domestic tuition is limited. So the only opportunity to increase revenue is through international revenue. Let's just be honest about why. And once we begin there, we need to challenge that position. Is this the revenue flow, and should that be the priority of the university? It is precisely why education hasn't been the focus of it. It's precisely why we're struggling to say, oh my God, we're losing X percent of our international students because we're losing X percent of our revenue. Now gives us an opportunity to think about this outside of a revenue stream. And let's be honest about education and solving global challenges. What are the challenges in the world our universities can help solve? That's going to make people excited about participating in our institutions and our institutions being other places in the world. And the world is full of seemingly unsolvable challenges. Clean water, educational equity gaps, gender equity gaps, climate change, geopolitical conflicts. These are places where our universities should be working with the international community in solving global challenges. That's the future, not revenue streams from international students.
Thank you both. That was an excellent question. Do we have other questions from folks in the field here? All right. While we wait for another,
Well,
I'm
I
going
see
to.
Michael has
Oh,
his hand raised.
we do. Michael, thank you. Oh, we're having a hard time hearing you. It looks like you're muted, Michael. I think we'll give you a minute to unmute, Michael, and we'll move to the next hand and we'll come back to you. That's okay. Arif, would you like to ask the next question?
Absolutely.
Okay, maybe you could type your question. It seems like we're getting some feedback just because we also have a group of listeners in the room where he's situated at the moment. Oh, Michael, you're unmuted.
I'm back.
Perfect timing.
This has been very informative. Although I'm retired and living in Florida right now, I spent 30 years at Syracuse University in New York. So I'm more or less I was more or less close to Canada at that point, but I have to admit that I didn't really have a view of what student affairs work was like in Canada as opposed to the US. But I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here that in some ways we're a stepchild of the overall academic mission. When you think of academic missions, when you think of attitudes of faculty and administrators, the helping students, in terms of overall knowledge, acquisition of knowledge, is a secondary aspect in the minds of some people in the institution. So that being said, student affairs has a hard road to work with because people in student affairs often are not listened to. Now, however, I've discovered in my research more and more student affairs personnel are obtaining their doctorates, and therefore they have some ability to talk with faculty. In fact, they sometimes teach, and that's good too. So there's a inroad right there. Okay, so that's one. And the second thing is explaining the role of student affairs to faculty. What's it mean to faculty, and what do you do for them that they don't have to do if there's a crisis or a problem or something with a student? So you have to reassure them that you're valuable and that you have some ideas too. And the second thing is that helping others in the institution, not just academic affairs, but in other student affairs offices, because internationalization is not quite on the tip of the tongue for, well, and Syracuse with the Greek letter organizations, for example. So we have to help them and others, registrar, so on and so forth, financial aid, to understand and achieve some competency in working with international students to listen, to learn how to listen, to learn how to ask questions, learn how to reach out to somebody if they don't understand an international student or the problem, or if there is a problem. That's where student affairs, international office staff really comes in handy. But it's in helping others gain those competencies, in addition to working with stakeholders and working with leaders who lead the institution, like behind the scenes, faculty who everybody goes to, but you don't know very well. And these people can help you. And I think that one of the ways that people get help is through articulating what you've said here, and that is the rationale, the goals, sustainability. These are concepts, but they are also some things that can be operationalized, and that international students can represent those factors. So, all I'm saying is that you have more than a bifurcated effort, in dealing with internationalization. And finally, this whole idea of mobility and dollars, that's a real tough piece, because institutions exist to survive, and they can't survive without funding. Now, mobility is seen as a way of extending that funding to ways in which the institution thinks it needs. But there's an international aspect to that, and coming to grips with how the world is functioning as opposed to how the institution is functioning affects the mission of the institution. So that whole idea of money, yeah, you got to have something there in order to do the other things, like curriculum, or go out and get money for the curriculum and then say, okay, I'm feeding into the mission by bringing this other money in. So I'm talking too long, but I'm just saying that there are many elements to this, and I'm really excited that you are setting out these challenges here on this webinar. Thank you very much.
Michael,
Denai, you want to? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, let me just make a quick comment on that. And thank you for your observation about the evolution of student affairs in the minds of faculty, right? So student affairs professionals have always understood our role at the institution. It's always been about convincing the academic side of the institution our value. Guess what has changed? More faculty members are cognizant of the value and importance of the student affairs work than ever before. I've been in college administration for 3 decades now, and I've seen the evolution. And guess who has changed it? Students. Students are going to their faculty member talking about, I have a concern regarding sexual violence. I have a concern regarding overconsumption of alcohol. I had a death in my family. A sibling just passed away. Where I'm recovering from COVID. Where should I go? I need help finding a career. I have a mental health challenge. I have an affordability challenge. And they're going to that faculty member, and that chemistry professor is saying, oh my God, who handles this? And that's when they learn about the dean of students. And they say, oh my God, I didn't realize there's a whole team of people at this university that's helping students resolve these problems. Thank you. Come to my class, tell my class what you do. How do I find out about you? Where's your contact information? So as students are tapping into their faculty members seeking support, these faculty members are saying, I don't have the capacity to do this. And that's when they learn about student affairs. And that's not new, but it has been heightened in the post-COVID period as our academic colleagues realize how important, how instrumental the student services work is to the institution.
I think it's funny that you say that, because I was talking to a member of our international office the other day, and they said, never before in my career have I felt more important than I do now. And never before have I had more people reach out to find out more about international student concerns than now. And it's for anybody in student services, it's wild to hear that. But I think that, we play an important role at the institution in the sense that, I believe that a university is a partnership. It is a partnership between the academic side of the house, the non-academic side of the house, the students that are coming here, and all the other peripheral things. So if you want to think of like government and community and all of that. And if you have that mentality that this is a partnership, then it does really propel you to want to know more about all the other parts of this machine that are moving us forward. And, in some sense, I feel like uh, we spent a lot of time educating our educators about how to create equity, how to support students. And for a lot of, in a lot of instances, we are the ones that have the greatest touch points, within our students and within our community. We see students at their most vulnerable. If a student has gone through a breakup and they can't do a midterm, we are supporting, them through that. And I think that that conversation will become more and more important as institutions think about viability and the future and how they want to invest. I think that we can no longer have the argument that, the academic side of the house is king, because we all play a role in supporting a student and in supporting student success.
Thank you, everyone. Those two sides of the house and how they work together is so important. One of my favorite pieces is Coup and Wits, the tapestry. And that tapestry, as Bridget started with, that everyone has to be a part of this, explaining that role as she outlined in the beginning, that we all have a role here, and that yes, faculty and academics do as well, but they are not the only role. And we all have a piece of that puzzle. And we do deal with crisis at the forefront. We are Deny. We are those folks who deal with that. I attend many higher education and post-secondary conferences, and I have to say the student services and affairs ones are some of the most cutting edge, because you can see the way the institutions are going to move with the various themes and topics and the practicality around it very quickly. And it's exciting and it's wonderful, and it should be lauded within this field. I'm going to turn over to the question in the chat, and also just take a moment to thank Arif Abu for putting all of this together, but also here with the wonderful question that he has. He says, in light of the numerous global crises that have recently affected students, what role do student affairs professionals play in supporting students navigating these challenges?
This has been consistently the work of student affairs. We monitor the world because anything happens in the world, a flood, a tornado, an earthquake, a war, we have students on our campus who are personally impacted by that. So we monitor what's going on in the world. And whenever that happens, our database student information system, we can look up the students from that region, from that part of the world, send them an email that morning to say, we are aware that this happened last night. Please let us know if you need any support from our offices. And here's the number, here's who you call, here's an email you can contact. Sometimes we'll build out a website of programs or services, or remind students of a website that already exists to support services related to global events. And for the past 20 years that I've been in college administration, every university I've worked for has had a mechanism for reaching out to those students who were recently impacted by something in the world. And sometimes a very small number of those students will call us or come in and say, hey, I need help because I can't contact my parents, or I don't have access to my bank account anymore because this happened in the world. A few students will reach out, but more students are appreciative that that their institution cared enough to realize something happened in their home country and sent them an email about it. So that's been something that we've been doing for decades now.
Yeah, and I think that we are building competency in students for how to navigate the world. And that is something that it's not easy to do, but it's something that we are doing every day. And, there is this misconception that students come to university to get all their education from the classroom. And that's not true. We are teaching students how to pay their taxes, how to, apply for healthcare, how to, in some cases, register their children into daycare. These are all competencies and education that we are helping to build in that student. And I think for a lot of institutions, it goes beyond what happens on our campuses. In many places across Canada, the university or the college or the post-secondary institution is the largest institution or the most diverse. And I think that there is a responsibility there to um, you know, to really operate with that consciousness in mind. I hear all the time from colleagues, I haven't had a Labor Day off since I started this career, because we all know come Labor Day, that's our Super Bowl. We're preparing for students to come in and to kick off the new year. We're talking to local city council about St. Patrick's Day and making sure that students are safe, that there are appropriate harms reduction approaches happening. We are working with students to navigate the court system if they're going through a sexual violence investigation or court case. We are doing things like mediation. We are referring students to embassies. We're doing all of these things that are very complex. And, I can't think of anywhere else in society where an individual can learn all of these things in one place. And I think that there's something for us to be proud of as educators and as institutions.
Absolutely. I think we are modeling governance. We model EDI. We model citizenship. It's a large role to fill. I'm going to, for the sake of time, turn over to our last question, which is from Shannon. And I'll ask that we be a little concise because we do have some closing remarks, if that's all right. Shannon, you have the floor.
Are you able to hear me okay? Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for our panelists' contributions. I found this talk really inspiring. But I really appreciated the introductory remarks that student success is everyone's business. But sometimes it feels like when we're talking about international students, oftentimes it's like passing hot potato to decide, whose responsibility are international students. So speaking from personal experience, oftentimes those international student supports are delegated to international student services, but I argue that the success of international students should be everyone's issue. So I'm wondering if you have any practical advice for getting some of that, targeted support for international students, but really identifying that it's not just international student services that should be providing some of this more targeted support.
I'll be very quick. So I think it was Lakehead University in Ontario at one point was trying to decide whether or not they were going to continue to support WUSC students. And they had a meeting, campus-wide meeting, and decided that yes, they wanted to continue to do this. Their president sent an email to every single person, every employee on that campus, and said, how are you going to support these students? How are you going to help us support these students? And this resulted in overwhelming support because people thought about their role, what they do on a day-to-day basis, and how they contribute to the success of that student. And so you had people from facilities saying, this is what we're going to do, people from the health center, people from the dining hall, people in the classroom. This is the type of community engagement that I think we need as institutions. It is everybody's business. And it's not, we obviously cannot teach courses like faculty, but I think if we think of things as a partnership, there are aspects that only we can do and aspects that we can all do.
And I'll be brief as well. We understand the reason for that hesitancy, part of the hesitancy is people are afraid to make a mistake. People are afraid to give the wrong advice that impacts a student's immigration or visa or any other status. So sometimes they will refer it to someone else on campus who actually knows how to do it. And that's where those specialization is critically important. But we can all listen. And sometimes that's all the student's looking for, a caring ear, someone who will listen to them, someone who will pull their, set aside their work for a minute just to sit down and listen to them. If we can all get into the business of listening, sometimes the proper referral is important. We've heard too many times of a student saying, Professor so-and-so gave me this advice and it was the wrong advice. And now it jeopardized their enrollment status at the university. So making sure that everyone can do the smallest thing at minimum, which is listen, I do think that's an important part because many people want to help, but they're afraid to make a mistake.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Ainsley Carey and Denai Boulanger. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. And thank you, everyone, for chiming in with these wonderful questions, considerations, and inquiries. I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Santiago Castillo, who's going to provide some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, this has been just an amazing webinar, an amazing presentation. I'm so thankful for all of our panelists this morning, everyone who attended and who also posed some really interesting questions. And as I was listening to the conversation, I couldn't help but to think how far we've gotten in the past couple of decades. I still consider myself a scholar practitioner. I started my career in higher education as a practitioner, actually in student affairs, even though most of my career has been in international affairs, in study abroad and international student services. I began in student affairs, and I was recalling the first time that I started attending these conferences for student affairs practitioners. I was part of those conversations that started spearheading what is today ESS, right? With Dr. Roger Luderman and some of his colleagues, Dr. Lisa Bardir Moscaritolo, and how this conversation started happening back in 2007, 2008, on how we could start working together throughout the world through student affairs, and how we could start sharing some best practices. I think mostly at that time we were thinking about sharing best practices on how to structure student affairs offices in different countries, what are good practices that we were seeing in our own campuses, a little bit of capacity building as well. And to see that now, actually student affairs are probably the best partner that international services have on campus is just, to me, amazing. A lot of the work that I do is kind of critical of the perspective that universities, I think, have abused this idea of recruiting international students for the purposes that better serve them as institutions financially, and in terms of bringing that multiculturality that they also we also sell as part of our educational experiences, and that has become a little bit dehumanizing, right? And so we attract a lot of international students, individuals, people that pretty much only share an immigration status. Other than that, are completely different human beings with different passions, different circumstances, different backgrounds. But yet we keep treating this group as a very monolithic, homogeneous group, and we sometimes forget that we have a huge responsibility in not just attracting them, but supporting international students once they're on campus. And that approach to becoming more, I guess, humanized support for international students on campus has really fallen onto student affairs practitioners, right? Student affairs have always been the heartbeat of universities, have always been this humanizing area on campus that sparks that joy that I think pretty much everyone, most of us here that work in higher education, that feel passionate about higher education, are so in love with higher education because of that sparks of joy and happiness and passion that we see in the students, that we see in the environment on campus, that has to do with the campus life and the environment that our student affairs practitioners inject in our environments and in our campuses. So I just love this, how this conversation has evolved into how we can better build those bridges among different areas on campus to better support our international students, and to make sure that everyone on our campuses, domestic, international, faculty, staff, can feel that they belong, and that they have everything they need to be successful, right? So to me, this has been a very powerful message that you all have shared with us. And on behalf of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, I'm just so thankful for your time, thankful for sharing with us some of these ideas, some of these experiences, and just a lot of reflections, I think, that you gave us, and some food for thought on moving forward and what we can do as scholars, as practitioners within the field of higher education. So once again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this panel. And before we close, also, I wanted to highlight a couple of other events that we will have in the upcoming weeks. We will have another edition, actually, of the Leadership Under Fire webinar, but not until next year. So stay tuned for that. Very early next year, we'll have a similar panel, but this time we're looking for creating a panel with chief diversity officers on campus and the role that these other offices have. But also in the more immediate future, we have a couple of events, both of them online webinars, free for anyone who wants to register. One is actually very related to what we just heard, and it's going to be precisely on international students, very specific in the Canadian context. So the title is "The Crash of the International Student Market: Causes, Consequences, and the Future of Canadian Higher Education." And that's going to be on November 6th, 2024 at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And if you receive our newsletter or you go into our website, you will find the information on how to register. But that's going to be a panel moderated by Dr. Sharon Stein from the University of British Columbia. And she'll be in the panel with Dr. Kumari Beck from Simon Fraser University, Dr. Dale McCartney from the University of Fraser Valley, and Dr. Lisa Brunner from the University of British Columbia as well. And then the other event that we'll have in November, and on November 15 at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we're doing together with the Council for International Higher Education of ASH, which is the Association for the Study of Higher Education. We're going to have a keynote speaker for the opening of the ASH conference this year. But the opening is going to be virtual, open to anyone. You don't have to be an ASH member. You don't have to be registered for the conference. And it's going to be by Dr. Riyad Shahahan from Michigan State University. And the title of his presentation is "Am I a Scholar? Time, Knowledge, and Decoloniality." And he will talk a little bit about what it means to be, a scholar in a globalized context, and the ideas that we might have of who is a scholar, who might we consider a scholar in international and comparative higher education, especially from a very anti-post-colonial, decolonial perspective of deconstructing our notions of scholarship, our notions of practice of higher education in different contexts. So we invite you to join us for those two events, and stay tuned for that third event early next year to continue these Leadership Under Fire sessions that have been so wonderfully, masterfully designed and thought of by my very esteemed colleague, Abu Arif. So thank you very much, Arif, for all your support and for always coming up with these great ideas, with these great panelists. And we really, really enjoy all of the conversations that we've had. This recording, unless anyone has some concerns, we would love to share this recording with our members of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network in our YouTube channel. So it's going to be available for everyone to rewatch or to share with your colleagues that you think they might benefit as well from this presentation. So thank you very much once again, and stay tuned for more information on more events, and have a great and lovely rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.